Good morning. It's really good to meet you all. My name is April Donor. I live here in Chicago. I live in Little Village. I'm with the Center for Next System Studies and with the ABCD Institute. So today I wanted to talk a bit about how we learn about the assets, the resources that are in our communities. How can that allow us to really be present for when there are threats and crises, but also how is it just a good thing to do anyway? I'll talk a little bit about the tradition of asset-based community development, and then why is it particularly relevant in this moment? And I'll share a little bit about the work we do with Next System. I'm a big believer in stories, so I want to start really quickly with a bit about my own story. I'm originally from Florida. I want to honor my grandmother, Ms. Polly Williams. She was the first community builder and connector that I ever met. She was one of those people that never met a stranger. Right? She could connect deeply with anybody. She was amazing at keeping in touch with people. At her funeral, we found out that everybody there received letters from her somehow. I don't know how she had the time for that, but that was one of my early influences. I grew up with kind of an interesting immersion in community. I was raised going to school on an ashram, a spiritual community, which you could also call a cult, called Kashi Ashram in Sebastian, Florida. So very early on, I had this kind of experience of a different way of living where people shared resources much more freely, combined living quarters, right? Things were done more cooperatively than they are in a lot of our culture. I think that really influenced me. I also had a weird tendency to collect business cards as a young child because somehow this knowledge of what people can do, what their names are, and how I can get in touch with them was I could just tell this was really important. And when I to ride around my neighborhood, especially when my dad got his own house and my parents got divorced, and I lived in one of those prefab housing complexes for retired people. I was one of the only kids. I would just tricycle around and meet my neighbors. Go to their garage sales. That was my favorite time. My dad would give me $5. And I was also just very sensitive early on to the fact that there were some big gaps in our culture, in our country, in my city. I picked up on kind of racism very early on, and it bothered me very deeply, as well as an economic divide. So that was something that I held with me as a child as I've grown. And so through that, I pursued understanding, how can community be the answer to these fissures and these problems? My journey took me many different places, visiting different communities from when I was a teenager. And then also stepping into different activist spaces and trying to kind of understand where's the sweet spot between these two, between these kind of beautiful, lovely, feel-good spaces where we center relationship and care, and where we also fight for when there's injustice, right, when there's wrongs that need to be right. So that journey took me into my college years. I went to New College in Florida. I was studying urban sociology, and I was obsessed with different stories of communities taking on their own power and their own stories, right? Taking charge of their own stories, like the Dudley Street and Neighborhood Initiative, the Zapatistas in Mexico. And my sociology professor, whose name was actually David Brain, so Dr. Brain, he's very smart, he gave me that green book over there, actually it's on the corner, Building Communities from the Inside Out by John McKnight and Jody Pressman, and it blew my mind. I realized here is this connection between righting wrongs and working against, problems and challenges and injustice and building community, right? And it also was this is so powerful because if you think of society, our microcosms are the neighborhood, right? And the answer isn't necessarily just to go create your own separate community external to the world. It's working with the neighborhoods that we already have, right? To reconnect each other and rediscover all of this abundance of skills and talents and passions that people have and to care for each other. So that's my story. That took me into relationship with the ABCD Institute. So this book founded a methodology called Asset-Based Community Development, ABCD. I became a faculty with the ABCD Institute about 20 years ago, and my journey has taken me many places. I'll share a couple of stories that I've had the pleasure of witnessing when people really took upon this charge to reconnect their neighborhoods and discover what's there. And currently, I work full-time for the Center for Next System Studies, which is where we really grapple with the systemic question of how can many of the problems and the challenges and the crises that we're seeing, how can we understand the system itself that has brought us there and think about a different system that we really want and that will serve us, that will serve everyone. So real quick, the origins of ABCD. How many people are familiar with this term, asset-based development, ABCD? You are. So I like to say this is something people have been doing as long as there's been people, as long as there's been other communities. It's very, very straightforward. I like to think of it as, before you go out and do your grocery shopping, you automatically, if you're smart, you check your own pantry, right? You check your own fridge, and maybe your garden, if you're a gardener, right? You see what you already have before you go outside of your home or your neighborhood to see what's, how to fill what's missing. So, this has been done since time immemorial. This term, ABCD, was a name that was given in modern times to recognize that this is what works, and we really need to get back to it. So very, very quickly, founders of this terminology and this framework are John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann. So John McKnight had a history here in Chicago. He was trained as an organizer by Saul Alinsky, who some of us have heard of him, right? Godfather of a very specific style of organizing. John found, though, that after organizing in that way, where you basically find out what are people the most angry about, what do they want to go challenge, and you build power for them to do that, he found this is important, and he was in relationship and community with many other organizers across the city for years. But you also can only keep people angry for so long. And then we need something else, right? We need something to feed our spirit. We need to care for each other. We need to feel like we belong, right? So the fight is important, but we need to be cared for it. We need to care for each other. And Jody Kretzmann had history as a journalist. So together, they joined up in they met in the 1980s and the 90s when John McKnight got a position at Northwestern University leading an urban center for research. He sat down with all of the academics that were there in sociology and anthropology and political science, and he asked them what they knew about these neighborhoods that they were studying. And what he found was that this is what they knew. I don't know, can you all see this okay? I'm sorry, there's a big giant thing in the middle. This was the picture that they had. This was the data that they had. This is what they were going out and looking for. Right? So this was the story they were telling, in that they were training people to go out and serve in communities and run programs and write policies. This is all they knew about these neighborhoods, right? John knew and Jody knew from working side by side with community members who were trying to better their neighborhood, to fight injustices, to build things together, that wasn't all that was there, right? There were people with incredible talents and passions and motivation. And they cared about these issues just as much as anyone trying to come in from the outside and fix them. And they could be, and they were often mobilized to do it. It might not always be visible, but it was there. So they went out and they said, there's clearly a data gap here. And they went and they knocked on 4,000 doors. They sat at the feet of neighbors and asked them to tell them a story. Tell me a story of someone who's done something that's made things better. So they collected 2,000 stories. And then that is what they took, and they looked at what are the patterns here, and they wrote this green book, right? Building Communities from the Inside Out. So this is based on actual evidence of what works in neighborhoods. And the two things that they found were that people started with what they had. They started with their own skills, their gifts, and those of their neighbors, and the assets that were around in their neighborhood. And they were the ones that took the lead. So they didn't wait around for someone else to come in and start it. They're like, let's just start with what we have and what we can see right in front of us as a solution and get going, right? So those were the two, and that was basically their proposal. We think this is what will change communities. We think this is the way to go about it, rather than what is often happening, almost always, which is we look at what's missing, we come up with a program, we pay people from outside the neighborhood to come and implement that program. And it's all about the needs, and it's all about filling needs. And we assume that no one there in that neighborhood has any of those skills or talents to implement any of these things either, right? And we also fragment people, right? There's a lot of really terrible things that result. Not to mention this negative story and narrative that becomes a story of neighborhoods that people internalize. It affects how investment happens, right? It affects so many things. So this is what they came up with as they looked at these 2,000 stories of what were some of the assets that people came up with. They talked about it as every neighborhood is different, but you can think of these ingredients that are similar to baking a cake, right? You got your flour, you got your sugar, you got your oil, you got, some flavoring. So these were some of the assets that they came up with. And this is another way to view it, right? So we can see all these needs, but we can see all that's there. This is the book they came up with. So this is a kind of pretty visual. So we've got individuals, we've got associations. So associations, anyone have an idea of what associations might mean? Yeah, right. So the key about associations is that they are driven by community members themselves. It's not run by paid staff. It could be a book club, it could be a walking club, it could be a neighborhood association, right? It could be churches, right? If it's where most of the people that are just members are doing the work, yes.
Is this going to be available online to look at afterwards?
Yeah.
Because
it's
it'd be lovely to be a part of it.
I know, I'm so sorry. Yeah. I know, I was told I had a projector, and then I was like, okay, well, this is what we got. So, yeah.
So we can read it afterwards.
Sorry. Yeah, so we've got associations, right? And these are, again, often not something you can find like through an online search, but they're there. Like neighborhoods are often teaming with them. You've got mothers groups, right? You've got all kinds. And then we have our institutions, right? So any idea of what those might qualify as?
Institutions?
Yeah.
Schools,
yep.
libraries.
Churches.
Yes, churches. Right, we got our government agencies, we got our nonprofits, right? You know, basically they're more structured. You know, they tend to be more hierarchical. We often use triangles to represent them, and circles to represent associations because those are more consensus-based. They're more cooperative, and both have their role, and both are very valuable. Other examples of institutions, we've got universities, right? Often, you know, they can be helpful, they can be harmful, but we like to try to find the ways they can be helpful to communities. You've got fire departments, you've got foundations, right? Can brainstorm a lot of. And then we also have these things that are a little bit less immediately tangible, but they are very powerful as well. So our local economy, our exchange, what are those flows? What are those structures? What are those systems that are there that might be under the radar of how people are exchanging resources and care, right? It could be through financial, it could be unpaid, right? It could be parents watching each other's children, walking them to school. I'm in Little Village neighborhood. We have a lot of people walking each other's children to school right now because of threats with, you know, those who are, you know, under attack, right? And then you also have culture and stories, right? This is an incredible asset that we have, that when you're in a thriving community, those stories are available, right? And not just stories of danger and problem and loss and suffering, but the stories of resilience, right? Of, you know, all of the talent that's in this community, right? Of when we were at our strongest or when we've overcome challenges. And then you have the most important one of all is our individuals, right? Actually, skip that a little bit, I mentioned it, but I want to say in every single story that John and Jody documented, individuals and their gifts were always at the center, right? So you have to start with the individuals. And I say that because a lot of times people take this methodology and they run with like asset mapping all the institutions and maybe associations, but they forget about centering the process and the work they're doing around how can we tap into people's actual gifts and getting them to give those gifts to the life of the community. So that's why I mentioned that. So some of the principles of ABCD, I'll read these because I know, I'm sorry about the slides. So everyone has gifts. Everyone has something to give, no matter how negatively labeled they have been, no matter how much they're struggling financially or materially, or if they have labels like developmental disabilities, right? Whatever their immigration status, everyone has something to give. A healthy community draws on the gifts of everyone, right? And allows them to circulate. We intentionally identify and mobilize the assets of individuals, especially those who are margins and who have been told, and we have been told, have nothing to give. And we center relationship building, right? Change happens through relationship. We talked about that earlier in the room, right? In the big room. We center relationship as much as we're doing projects and trying to accomplish things. Relationship is the core of the work that we do. And then we believe in people being the leaders, because those people that live in the neighborhoods, they're the experts of their own situation, right? There's been a large growth in the last 10 or 20 years around people with lived experience, and honoring that, building that into our programs. So this was originally really argued by ABCD. And then one of my favorites is that our greatest need is to be needed, right? So we need to have that feeling that someone needs what we have to give. And to just be put in a position of accepting help or accepting charity is actually, it can be harmful, right? It can be harmful to our spirit and our psyche and our emotions. So we really want to tap into the fact that, like, we need everybody. I won't go too deeply into this because I want to share some stories. I'm also an artist. That's one of my gifts. So this was, if you can kind of see it, this is like my own visual representation of how I see ABCD. We dig where we are. And as we do that, we start to unlock this abundance in our communities. And as we do that, we build structures and practices and cultures for how all of this abundance could get actually utilized. And one of my favorite phrases about this work is it's about making the invisible visible. Okay? And so it's like there's many ways to go about it. There's really no blueprint for it. It's really about a lens and a spirit and an understanding of how change happens. But making the invisible visible is just a great one to stick with. Another is a poem by Mary Oliver, who's my mom's favorite poet. Instructions for living a life. Pay attention. So how we look is incredibly important, the lens that we go in with. Be astonished. Allow yourself to be surprised and delighted by what's there. And then tell about it, right? Telling the story, making the invisible visible is so important and in itself can often foster community and strength and power and collaboration. So let me check the time. All right. So early, as soon as I got out of college, and I drunk the Kool-Aid of ABCD, I also had the pleasure of taking a training with John McKnight, who kind of just embodied this whole spirit, and I was like, okay, I'm even more in now. I had the fortune of landing at a very small civic engagement nonprofit called Scope. And so our focus was on several different neighborhoods. I got to kind of redesign the neighborhood initiative with John McKnight's mentorship, and it was amazing. So one of the neighborhoods we worked in was Newtown. And this was a neighborhood which was basically the African-American section of Sarasota because of how things have happened historically with different populations deciding that they wanted land. That neighborhood had been moved and had to recreate themselves when basically the white people decided they wanted downtown. So Newtown was the new town that Black people had built. It was isolated in many ways. The story of many African-American neighborhoods, right, had been disinvested. Have experienced like large levels of crime and poverty. But my job, which I was so grateful to have, was to go in and find out what was there in partnership with community members. So Mary Butler and I became like that. And we went about finding out, what is the abundance here? Uncovering so many associations, so many amazing stories, so many individuals, especially that were just every day giving their heart out to their community in all of these different ways, whether it was supporting different entrepreneurs or supporting the youth. Miss Iris, who was basically where the young people would go to talk about their lives and what they were struggling with. She didn't have a social work degree, right? That was just her gift, And her son Cody, or her grandson Cody, who was a hip hop artist, and helped young people learn how to record music and was always out selling his CDs on the street. All these people that when we had the chance to sit down and have one-on-one learning conversations with them, we uncovered all this amazing commitment, right, and care. So one of the stories that I wanted to share, because I think it's relevant to the topic of meeting challenges and community defense, was about Larry Curiel and the Friendly 15. So they lived on one of the streets. It was right next to the railroad tracks in Newtown. And what they found was that the presence of police in that neighborhood, which is a common story, did not make any of them feel safer. In fact, it was quite the opposite, right? So they decided, well, we do have some crime. We have some drugs happening in the neighborhood. We don't like it. We don't trust the police. So what can we do? So Larry talked to a couple of his buddies that lived on the block and said, what do you think about us taking this into our own hands, right? How can we make our block safer? And they said, yeah, that sounds good. Let's call ourselves a Friendly 15. We're only 3, but we want to be 15. So we're the Friendly 15. Then they went out and talked to some of their buddies. This was all men. They decided to make it like a male-led effort and talked about, okay, so what could we do? We can keep our eyes on each other's houses. We can give each other the keys to our homes. We can, notify each other through phone calls and, talking on the block when we see something that's not good. And we can also, team up and go confront when someone's doing something on our block that we don't like in a way that is, friendly, but firm. On that block, within about 5 years, they saw an incredible reduction in violence. right? And also didn't, and ideally the police are helpful, but in that case they weren't, right? So they were able to do that as their own initiative. I will say too, I was part of a lot of city-driven work in that neighborhood. Almost nobody knew about that story. And all of the planning they were doing about violence and safety, like that model and that thing that he had done just went completely unnoticed. Wow. So that was a learning lesson for me. Another story that I had the pleasure of being immersed in was in Indianapolis. So in 2013, I decided to move myself to Indianapolis to do work with a group of folks out of Broadway United Methodist Church. So their story was, this was a mostly white congregation situated in a mostly African-American, lower-income neighborhood. The pastor, Mike Mathers, actually not pictured here, he was a white guy. He had read John McKnight's stuff. He'd been inspired by it. He said, what if I stop taking a charity approach to helping the neighborhood? And what if I start to take an investment approach, right? So he just started walking the streets of the neighborhood, basically having conversations with neighbors, and putting on that lens of abundance. And again, this was a very negatively labeled neighborhood, right? People would change the tone of their voice when they talked about the neighborhood. And so he then uncovered so many amazing stories, right, of talented, gifted, beautiful neighbors. One of those was this fellow Diamond, who had the unique gift of doing this naturally without anybody asking him to. So they decided, okay, how can we as a church invest in the goodness in this neighborhood and lift it up and strengthen it? Let's hire Diamond. He's already doing this. He's already good at it. So they said, hey, we want to hire you to do what you've already been doing. We want you to tell us what your title will be. Together they came up with the roving listener, because that was what he did. He would go and he would take one block a week and he would go and he'd listen. And he'd listen. He'd have natural, organic conversations on people's porches, over their tables, in the street. He was an artist and he had his daughter. He would bring his daughter with him. And as he did that, he started to find all of these stories and all of these categories of talents and gifts, right? So he found gardeners, he found artists, he found healers, he found teachers, he found people that cared about the youth. And so then they started to think about, what do we do with all of this? Well, maybe we could connect them up, right? So they found people who had said they loved to cook. They found people that said they loved to host. So they hired the people who could cook, because if you want to change poverty, you should probably just hire people and invest in them instead of just like putting them through a bunch of programs all the time, right? So they hired the cooks and asked the hosts if they would host conversations to connect these people who had shared interests. So they got the gardeners together. Didn't really need an agenda because they're all gardeners, right? So they just went crazy talking about, how do you grow this? And let's do a street swap. So they also started to come up with a project for the neighborhood, right? Which was, hey, what if we had a tool lending library? We'd love more of our neighbors to be able to grow their own food. So they just kind of got going on their own with a little bit of support, right, from Diamond checking in with them. He connected the artists and kind of thing. They started supporting each other in their own arts. And then they supported each other in their own career. And then because of relationships that the church had, right, because this is a white institution in Indiana, right? So they had a lot of credibility that most of these neighbors did not have, right? As lower income African-American people, they did not have access to a lot of things, but the church did, right? So relationships that Mike Mather, the pastor, had, he was able to hook them up with a spot to have a group show in one of the Park District's beautiful buildings that ended up launching each of their careers to a whole new level, right? But it was started by the artists themselves. And then the church gave them a room. The church, one of their assets was they had kind of too much space. So they said, here, we're not going to this is one of the assets we have. Use this room, use it for whatever you want. So the artists, and this was one of the places I visited. Let's see, that's a photo I took. This was the arts room. That's Terry Martin. Became one of the leaders of the artist group. Also happened to be unhoused, right? But this was a gift he was giving. He was active about. Was an amazing organizer, right? And so then they started to do things for the young people, right? They started to do pumpkin painting for the really young kids. But they enlisted the teenagers in helping with that. Teenagers who were interested anyway, and hey, I have some art skills. I'd love to learn how to be an artist. And then they had these automatic mentors and these to begin from. So those are a couple of stories. And more and more, there's so many stories, honestly. When you start to do this, and you think in this way, we call it the problem of abundance, right? It's you almost have more than you know what to do with. So in asset-based community development, there's some really cool tools and processes that you can utilize to help make sense of this and be a bit more strategic as you're going about it. Right? The practices that I just named in these stories, walking, having conversations, having meals, right? Having celebrations, and then strategically connecting people, supporting what they do. Like, that's really the essence of it. But there's some tools and practices that are within ABCD that you can also pick up, because sometimes I find it useful to have like really structured stuff. I don't know if anyone else is the same way. This is a resource I want to lift up along the lines of the moment we're in. This is actually by Kelly Hayes. I don't know if y'all are familiar with her. She's here in Chicago. And she's been doing a lot of really great work around community defense, around system change, and community building. So just to lift up, like, in this moment that we're in, a crisis of enhanced attack on our communities. Right now specifically, it's our immigrant communities, but I think a lot of us realize that it's not necessarily going to just be, contained to that, possibly. Even those who are standing up for them have been attacked, and of course, many of our communities have been under violence, systemic violence for a long time. What's that?
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a resource that Kelly Hayes developed for actually mapping assets that are uniquely useful for community defense. This is linked in the slides, so I'm going to make sure Nate gets these all to you. And let's see, I'm going to skip this and just talk real quick about some of the practices. So one-on-one learning conversations and listening campaigns is something, it's a traditional organizer approach, right? So we named it in the big room out there. This is what we all do. Like, think about when you're in between jobs, like, what is one of the best techniques is to like call up your friends and your contacts and say, hey, let's get lunch or let's get coffee, right? Same thing in community building and community organizing. That space where you're sitting down and really able to hear someone's story. And there's some questions that have been developed that can be really useful for pulling out what are the things this person cares about? What are the skills and talents that they have to give? What is something that they'd be interested in joining? What can they teach others about? There's like this whole amazing vast richness of resources that have been developed by neighbors to think about how can they pull out this information, how can they use it, how can they categorize it, how can they use it to build the projects and the initiatives that they want to do. A listening campaign is one way of stringing learning conversations together, where basically you choose a time period. It could be like 3 months, it could be 6 months, and you get a small group of people who really like connecting with others and having these kinds of conversations to go out, have those conversations, come back and meet. You might actually pick up a few along the way if there's people you're having conversations where like, oh, I really like what you're doing. Can I join? And you say yes. So you grow the circle of connectors over time. And then at the end of that, you bring everyone together to celebrate and share. These are the gifts and the talents that we learned about. And then you facilitate a process to think about what can we do with them. What are some project ideas? What are some solutions? Right? What are some ways? And so there's some resources in these slides for that. This is a really short amount of time, so I apologize. I'm like really fire hosing you right now. Finding and supporting connectors is a really critical key practice. So we talked about that with Diamond, right? I got to be a connector. I worked with Mary, who was a connector. So these are people that are really just talented and wired this way. So finding those people, enlisting them. If you have the money, pay them. If you don't, see what they're willing to do just in some kind of exchange, in some kind of collaboration. And then enlist them in this work because they are wired to do this, right? Asset mapping itself is really just a concentrated way, kind of like if you do inventory, again, before you go out and do shopping or do like an order for your business, you're going to do inventory of what you have. It's a way of learning and then making inventory of what the community has. And then just building it over time, right? Like, it can be a community process, it could be a part of the community celebration, it could be a digital resource that you share with each other and people add to, and then everybody can tap into it, right? And then shifting and sharing power, that mostly relates to how do we get institutional people, so people who are paid to come in and serve community, how do we get them to think differently about their role? So kind of like Mike Mather was like, hey, I'm not here just to come in and do 2 people, or even just 4 people, but do with them and support them to do with each other, right? So that's about, that's a strong thread within ABCD, and there's some really good tools around that. So I'm gonna pause here. There's like way more slides, and those will be in the slides for you. And I know we're wrapping up soon. So I wanted to open it up for any questions I know this is a lot of information, but yeah, or any way that you have been using this kind of approach. I know I have a chance to work with Carol through Chicago Peace Fellows. He's been using ABCD. Yeah.
Well, we've been doing something similar to that. I'm a chairperson for the Fourth Teacher Faith-Based Organization, and also the president of our organization. And we go out and we try to go to different communities in the Fourth District. And we really go by the strategic plan the Fourth District set up. So we kind of know the areas, and we go into those areas and try to empower the residents. We go every Friday to an area where there may be violence or something. We try to empower the residents, get them to come out on their own, because we want to see them come out on the corners when something happens, and not just us come out. So the asset mapping is something we started thinking about. Who are all the players in the community, new businesses, libraries that we can get involved in this charge? And so this is really great.
Good. Yeah. Well, so you're already doing this in a lot of ways. Yeah. And just adding a little bit of asset mapping, you're gonna take off. I'm excited if you're. Anyone else?
I got a question.
Yeah.
If you've heard of Robert, and if you've read any of his stuff, he's still with us. Robert L. Woodson Sr. Lessons for, but he's a Chicago guy. It's the Woodson Institute. If you search him, Lessons for the Less of These.
Robert Woodson.
Robert L. Woodson Sr. And he's got maybe 100-page book, and it's just so right on taking the assets you've already got, all that looks like, and the resources are right there.
Nice.
And you don't hear about them much, because he was on the radio. I guess I heard it maybe about a month or so ago. So you don't hear a lot about the players, because the players are all working instead of going on TV.
Totally.
And so they're there.
Yes.
So I have a question. Yeah. A lot of the, and this 4 steps that you're talking about here, you see a lot of faith-based organizations, non-for-profit, like he just stated, non-for-profit organizations, a lot of communities, and even like police. We follow this, if not exactly similar, in a similar way. Based on your research and your studies, where do you think our greatest area of opportunity might be? Where are we missing?
So, well, I will, for myself and the trajectory I've followed, I've come to believe that it's reaching the point of understanding the bigger system that has been producing the inequities that we're dealing with, and then a lot of the things that flow out of those inequities. So basically, a lot is shaped by our economic system, which is rooted in extraction and, exploitation, both of us as human beings and of our earth. It treats us as an infinite resource, and it treats the earth as one, but it's not, right? And so looking at, and this is something that a lot of, groups who both practice community care and social and political justice work we're very open about, right, back in the 60s and 70s, but then that was very much squashed, and now we've kind of fragmented these efforts. So that's a lot of the work we're doing with Next System Studies, is looking at, how can we becoming more aware of how the system is operating, and then looking at alternatives that we can build that we actually own and control, whether it's economic or ways of enacting, healing and conflict resolution and justice, right, instead of the current one that we have. The way of producing our food, the way of having our housing, right? How can those be things that are not extractive, but are actually life-giving and giving to our community and under our control? So that's the biggest one. That's what I've chosen to kind of pour this part of my life into. How do we bridge that with a conversation about community building from that granular neighborhood level?
Yeah. I think, and this came to me, that mapping between what you just said, the systems, to the individuals, people there. That's where we'll get that. We'll find out what they need and where the system is that is from.
That's a great point. Yeah, we're working on some of that with the. So we have. I'll just plug real quick. So we have the Next System teach-ins going on. We just hosted one in Chicago in November. We had a wave of teach-ins, but basically we're inviting people to take on this next system question. What is a system that we do want that serves us, that serves everyone? And have basically teach-ins, which is a old school mobilizing tool that was used in Vietnam War, Earth Day, lots of different issues, and have that question together in our communities. So we're going to be organizing one towards April 2027 here, but across the globe. We're going to have a wave of teach-ins. So community building, this question of faith-based leadership, those are all really critical for looking at our economic system. We have things like deep participatory governance. How do we link these things together and understand that these are all interrelated solutions and pieces of the puzzles of us thriving together? And I will plug this next system teach and organizer workshop. We have our first one coming up April 24th, so we'll actually be hearing. We had the organizers across the Americas, so we had Puerto Rico, Argentina, Toronto, Chicago, Duluth. So we'll be hearing from them about what they learned about organizing their teach-ins and how that has advanced their own work as a way of kicking off towards April. Any other impressions, thoughts, stories, questions?
Good information.
Good.
My name is Francis. I'm the new CEO of Garfield Counseling, and the Madison Corridor is coming.
Mm-hmm.
And I was not a part of the organization when they start planning. My job is to get a seat at the table so that I'm not left out. Because that whole block, if anybody 4100 block of Madison, it looks like a ghost town. But I'm there viable, living and serving over 200 clients.
Wow.
So, it has helped me look at some other things.
Okay, good. Yeah, there's some great examples of how ABCD has been used for economic development. It's driving me crazy. Our ABCD Institute website, they took a lot of resources down, so there's one called The Story of the Mercado Central, which they basically did an asset inventory of the gifts and talents. It was a mostly immigrant community, and they found out what were business, sellable skills people had, small businesses that they hadn't quite made formal yet, but also aspirational businesses, and use that to create basically like a cooperative economic development initiative that churches were part of, a local. Yeah.
My biggest fear is gentrification. It's already taken place because they've left property empty for so long, and I know what that means. Other people have purchased it, and so that we can keep our culture. And that's my biggest fear. And I think this is really helpful. Change some things on that and put this online because I can't remember everything.
Yeah, there's much more tools in here. I'm sorry.
I said this is a good point of reference.
Okay, good. I'll also plug as part of so Next System Studies is housed at George Mason University. So we have a Next System program there. We have the Next System speaker series, and our next one is coming up next Tuesday. It's on community wealth building. Okay. So that's a very it's very much in alignment with ABCD. It's this whole thing about how do we create community wealth, how do we create structures that really give back to the community or promote the community. Never too shocked treat. She's great. She's going to be speaking. So I'll make sure Nate. I don't think that's in the slides. I'll make sure that gets out.
What's that discussion?
What's that? Wednesday.
When or what was it?
Yeah, so that's our Next System speaker series. It's on Tuesday, I think at 12. And if you go to...
Are these on your, the things that you're referencing, are they on your website?
I will make sure. There are so many resources is the thing. So I'm going to note these down and make sure that these specific ones come out to you all in the follow-up. Yeah, so the Next System speaker series, the
Do you have any idea where it's going to be?
that will be virtual.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so anyone can join. And any other questions? If we had more time today, what I would have done is my favorite exercise, and that's in the slides, and I encourage you to do and take up and do within your workplace, your community meeting, your association, is doing one-on-one gift conversations. There's 4 gifts that have been kind of teased out by different community groups, the gifts of the head, heart, hands, and human connection. And just get people interviewing each other for those. Write it down and create your own asset map. It's a really wonderful way not just to deepen relationships and really fill yourselves with a sense of abundance, but actually get this like concrete data that you can start to use even as a team or a group, and then think about how could we do this with community. So that would be one of my first encouragements. Go take that. That's in the slides.
You said gifts of the head, the heart,
And then human connection. So things you know a lot about, like you could talk for 20, 30 minutes to people, you're just geeked out about it and you know a lot. The hands are just like skills, you know, you can sew, you can cook, you can build stuff, you can build databases really well. The heart are the things that you're deeply passionate about, and if someone called you up like on a Saturday morning and said, hey, there's something happening, can you go, you would say yes, right? It's that thing that motivates you about the world or your community. And the gifts of human connection is what makes you a good friend or neighbor or partner or workmate, right? How are you good at being in a relationship?
I like this because it's a way we can start doing surveys. Because I like to play games.
Yes.
That's the only way we know where we're going. I like to collect the data before we start going out in the summer, in the different individuals, the community, to see what they're needing. Not only see what they need, but now to see what's here.
Yes. Because the greatest need is to be needed, right?
So that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. And make sure you have a plan. One of the things I'll also say is when you do asset mapping, that's why we emphasize identifying connectors. Because, you know, the map, there's a lot of times people do asset mapping and they're just like, okay, great, we did asset mapping. But have some kind of plan, have some kind of way you're planning on actually celebrating those and connecting those. That's why connectors are such a big part, and that's why we have like a listening campaign. There's some actual like process you have in place. Because otherwise you're just going to go crazy, or it's going to sit on the shelf and people are like, why did you ask me about that if you're not going to use it? And then you can actually create some goodwill.
Yeah, I've got great positions because I'm in the faith-based organization. I'm also a heat facilitator, so I can get this out around.
Awesome. Well, I'll hand out my cards as well. Please let me know if you have other questions. Just pass these around. Yeah. And please share back with me if you use this and what stories come out of.
Give you first-hand report.
Yes. Yes.
Give you first-hand report.
If you need more, I got some more. I saw. You got it. Did you receive it?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Anybody else? And so thank you all so much. I know we are at time, but please feel free to get at me with any questions. Hey, Tony, we got a practitioner. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks all.